My name is Michelle Evans. I'm from the Melbourne Business School. I'm an Aboriginal woman from the Hunter Valley of New South Wales in Australia. And thank you very much for coming along. We'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting here on the traditional country of the Seminole and the Muskogee nations and clans. The Seminole are a nation of Indigenous people that never surrendered to the invaders of their country. I would like to acknowledge their elders, past and present, and all Indigenous people in the room today. And importantly, I want to acknowledge Indigenous young people across the world as they are the leaders of the future. Today, this symposium brings together a diverse group of scholars who will provide a complex, embodied description on how they bring different worldviews into their research in the Management Academy by upholding Indigenous and culturally diverse perspectives grounded in non-Western epistemological traditions that can bring richness and innovation to our Management Academy.
Hello everyone. So I will start the first part. We are going to talk only for 5 minutes. And I will start with the first part called economic hegemony. We see pressures for Indigenous people to integrate, to assimilate into the mainstream economy as the only way to do it. And those seeking those alternatives, often presented by academics and policymakers, they are just present one alternative. And everywhere I have seen communities torn apart, right? Because they have to either go for economic development and forget about who they are and what their cultures are about, or, and that's how it is presenting, or reclaim the tradition, the language, the forms of spirituality, justice systems, economic models. So what is presenting is the hegemony of capitalism and its objective for economic growth. That's the only way, and we see that everywhere, the famous Tina, there are no alternatives. And we don't see it only in Indigenous people, we see it in many poor communities as well. So when we do this, we are ignoring the strength and diversity of Indigenous communities and their ways of life, right? All that is erased, all that is forgotten, that's not possible. So when we refer to hegemony, what we are referring for? We are referring to the cultural domination by making certain social, economic, political arrangement natural and beneficial. So, for example, when we are talking about Adam Smith, the famous, we are all having our nature to be self-interested. We are all in our nature to be homo economics, right? We are all, it's part of the human nature. Right? And beneficial, we talk about for many years there have been many theories of development, and one theory has been modernization theory. Let's make others look like us, right? And us means the Western world, one way, right? There is that way, and that's good for you. It's what we have been telling, and many people, and Indigenous people, that's good for you, okay? So, what hegemony does is bring no-dominant practices and ideas into relationship with it in order to subjugate. No longer, I think, what we are observing is to ignore it, but bringing it to subjugate it. And then what we're talking is we measure those practices against capitalism, and when we are doing that, we say, well, those things exist, but they are not realistic. They are not real, right? They are partial. And we see that a lot, I have to say, in the literature of BOP. We are talking about representing something as unrealistic, as a partial, right, and subjugated, but also brings a reality. This word, this economic hegemony, become a reality. So what we have when the mining company robs in indigenous people, it is called business and development. We're bringing business and development. When they pull far back, we call it terrorism. I have been in Peru just lately, where mining companies going like crazy, and in 2 weeks we have 10 people dead and people in jail, called terrorism, because they are fighting for their lives, they are fighting for their livelihood, they are fighting for their ancestors, they are fighting for their earth, for their mountains, for their relatives. So we are taught over and over and over that there are no alternatives, right? All over and over. But when we see, people need to get in the market. Forget about all the other stuff. They need to be. But if we look at in the long run, if we look historically, there are people that have been challenging, and we can look at the economic anthropologists, the history, right? Markets having existed for a long, long time. And one of the people that I really love is Carl Polanyi and Robert Halbreiner. They remind us that actually this received view from Adam Smith, we are all economic men, we are all the tendency to self-interest, that doesn't exist across different cultures. And markets have existed, but no market system. And what we have through history is a diversity of economic arrangements, diversity of arrangements. And what they tell us is the economics and other exchanges have been traditionally being embedded. That means that there are other considerations, social, right, political, ritual, spiritual, to drive our economic life. Right now, what we have is our economics drive everything. We see it even in the universities. Sometimes I have to ask my dean and the vice president and say, what is the role? What brings us together? It's the social purpose, right? So when we are talking about embeddedness, we are talking all these different considerations, right? Now are reversed. Also requires the commodification of land, work, and money. So if it doesn't go to the market, doesn't exist. And we really, in commodifying our economic life, our indigenous economic life, and closure and so on, have a tremendous bad consequences for many indigenous people. So the standard economic analysis, what we see, doesn't apply everywhere. So there are many other authors that have been challenging this economic hegemony. We have, for example, the work of Gibson Graham, and she talked about capitalocentrism. And she actually asked us, okay, how we can, deconstruct this fixation, this articulation, this common sense built of this fable that we are living on. Okay? So let's think about alternatives. Let's think about what happened when we just have monocrop. And in my experience, and we will come back to that later on in this third or fourth part of this session, there are alternatives, and there are things that indigenous peoples are doing. Some of the questions that we need to think when we talk about this concept of hegemony is that this is a concept that led us to the need to question what is taken for granted as truth, and what are the meaning of central concepts. How do management discourses articulate and fix truths and meanings as hegemonic? What indigenous meanings and practice are hidden, devaluated, and destabilized by economic management theories? So I will ask you to think about those things.
I'd like to lead the discussion into the knowledge domain. Indigenous researchers and Indigenous communities bring a different worldview of the work of research. producing culturally endowed knowledge from a foundation of Indigenous ways of knowing, of being and of doing, a unique quality to the production of knowledge. Epistemology builds upon individual Indigenous researchers' connections to country, to family, ancestors, and their embodied receipt of cultural knowledge. The axiology is fixed in the relationship between their cultural knowledge and cultural value systems, how they have it and how they practice it, how I practice it and what my knowledge is. My ontology is an embodied expression of cultural knowledge and connection often expressed through belonging. So when building knowledge, there's a relational aspect to Indigenous worldviews. The foundations for constructing our knowledge and research reflect our cultural values and underpin our worldview. Indigenous people embody cultural knowledge and values. This is received generationally and passed down through cultural knowledge to each other, and coupled with their own personal and socialised experiences, people then enact ways of knowing. The construction of time and the nature of multi-generational relational connection and knowledge exchange are the two kind of key tenets that illustrate Indigenous epistemology. Indigenous knowledge is cyclical by nature rather than linear. Indigenous scholars build knowledge by connecting the past, the present and the future into the significance of their research investigations. Rather than establishing a linear chain of events, this deep concept of time, sometimes referred to as the eternal now, emphasises that the present and the past and the future is all happening right now. That we are standing, of course, on the shoulders of our ancestors and that we are responsible for bringing in the world that we are hoping to create. So using even Mary Boyd Begay and Nichols' Navajo epistemology, they discuss how they connect the past to the future to create a circular understanding of time. And what that does is it really discloses the polarity of thinking, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. The second tenet to an Indigenous worldview really builds on knowledge through multi-generational relational connections. So connection between generations, elders to the younger generation, reinforces the importance of sharing and of passing on cultural knowledge and values, and the importance of relationships and relational thinking. So thinking about these things as a foundation to how one produces knowledge is really important. So Indigenous epistemology does have a very complex relationship with Western knowledge, and particularly Western Cartesian empirical knowledge, as it struggles to validate cultural connectedness and contextualise knowing, and asserting what Western knowledge tends to do is assert that this way of knowing lacks external rigour and is essentialist, and that the divide between Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems becomes irreconcilable in the academy. So what do we do? I want to also just point out that there is a real colonising role of the English language. It's a very noun-based language, and it's a very bipolar language. It's all about polar opposites. If you say black, it inherently brings in your brain white. If you say left, it inherently brings in your brain right. So there is a subtle paradox when we start to think about the best ways to try and bridge this quite difficult divide. One of the ways in which Indigenous researchers, and myself in particular, tends to go about doing this is by producing an Indigenous standpoint through research. It's not a reflection just of experience, but it's an interweaving of social and cultural theory in order to assert the importance of my embodied knowledge and what I bring to the research investigation. So having established an Indigenous epistemological framework, Research tends, Indigenous standpoint research tends to be practiced by Indigenous researchers, supervised by Indigenous researchers or researchers who are experienced in social science or critical theory, research that is well versed in critical theory, and research that has a benefit for the community. So I think one of the important things to start to understand, going from the foundations of the epistemology, is that Indigenous research, at least the way in which I construct it, always has to be linked to what is the benefit for the community. And then we turn to the protocols about doing that. And these are very long, in-depth, investigational, ethical frameworks that one has to establish in terms of working in an Indigenous ethical research way. It's about consultation, negotiation, mutual understanding. There's a lot of protocol guidelines in Australia that we use. And you know, Aboriginal people are by far the most researched people on the earth, so this whole extractive nature of the research investigation again and again kind of compounds it. So the idea about co-researching about what Aboriginal communities and people get out of the research investigation becomes an absolute key part of it, as does issues of authorship, issues of ownership. So these are the sort of things that embed an Indigenous way of doing research.
So we're moving to our next part of the conversation, where I will be telling you a little bit more about the story of these communities that assert their own subjectivities and the way in which these can be understood as leadership work. Social change leaders are very aware of this exploitative relationship that exists, and they push to level the playing field. And as I told you, we were pushed to really renegotiate the relationship. And this manifested capacity to change the power relationships in the research is really an expression of what we found in the larger research process, of their capacity to do work to address changes in the broader power structures in which they work. And so there's a lot that we learn about leadership work for social change, even from the beginning with this experience. And so I want to briefly illustrate some of the points that have been made here in terms of doing collaborative research, but more importantly to focus on how when doing this kind of research with the encounter of the two epistemologies, what you can find is a new space, a new way of thinking about leadership, and that's the illustration that I want to bring here. And so, as a reminder, just a very brief background: these social change organizations are characterized by a commitment to working with marginalized communities themselves, using a systemic approach that looks at root causes rather than symptoms, and aims at actually changing the power relations. The research project was working with 5 cohorts of about 20 organizations each for 2 years each, on around 6 years. And we developed a design that was multimodal, qualitative research. We ended up producing about 10 ethnographies, about 40 narrative case studies, and about 10 action research projects, all in negotiation and collaboration with the groups. Our question was, in what ways do communities trying to make social change engage in the work of leadership? And so from the question itself, you notice that we're talking about the work of leadership, leadership as process, as an outcome, rather than leaders' qualities, which is what the traditional mainstream research has focused on, right? So it's about narratives, about the work that they're doing to change something out there in the world, to make their life better, and how that work requires the development of leadership and leadership capital. Just as an example, here is an organization of the 92 organizations that we worked with. The name is Poder, and it's an organization in East Austin, Indigenous Latino neighborhood, which organized as large companies started to dump industrial waste around and close to their own houses and gardens, and they organized not only their community but other closed communities, African American communities and other communities of color. And the types of things that they're being able to do is like they passed an ordinance that requires that any new economic development effort in the area requires citizen consultation, neighborhood consultation, and they were able to close a large dumping area that was affecting the health. So this is an organization that really produces very concrete transformations at the policy level and at the level of relating to the other influencing stakeholders. And if you look at the name itself, poder means power in Spanish, but also it's the name itself, it's defense of Earth and her resources. So the epistemology is itself presented, manifested, embodied in the title itself. And it draws, the people in Poder draw from this indigenous culture to articulate their work very much. Poder represents one of 11 of the 92 organizations that were indigenous organizations by themselves. And again, these organizations work in all kinds of areas: economic development, environment, youth development, education, arts, etc. And they did the traditional critical tasks that you find in any social change organization. So they did advocacy, organizing, community building, service delivery. And at first we thought that's where we were going to find, that was the leadership work. And then we realized not necessarily, or not exclusively. They also manage these organizations, so they do strategic planning, budgeting, like all the traditional technologies of management applied to the type of work that they do. Then we thought, as many nonprofit leadership perspectives, that that's where the leadership was. And then as we went deeper, we realized, no. In reality, there is an additional intentional type of work that's very invisible if you take a traditional positivist epistemology that gets lost, and that is really, really very important in terms of thinking about the type of work that's being done in these organizations. And so we started to notice a lot of the practices, and then we started noticing that we could categorize them according to how the practice helped contribute to transform individual efforts into collective achievements. And we realized that there were at least these three practices. There may be many other practices there, but it's a reframing discourse that really challenges the hegemonic assumptions that are there. It's about bridging difference inside the organization and with other organizations to create the connectedness that brings the resources that are needed, and it's unleashing human energies so that the capacity that is needed by the group gets to be created. And so in the name of time, I'm just going to risk very simplistically give you an example of how this happens. Poder actually engages the formal authorities. They go in the street and protest, but they also go to the state institutions and do work inside. And so here we have a member of Poder doing testimonial for advancing a particular issue in a particular campaign. And it turns out that every time they go to do testimonial or engage in any Western institution as such, before they start, they're quiet and they recite this prayer. There was a time that we were all sisters and brothers, the night sky our ceiling, the earth our mother, the sun our father, our parents were leaders, and justice our guide. And then there's silence. So I just wanted to briefly illustrate the three practices at work here. We separate them for pedagogical reasons, but they work together. So the first one is reframing. So here she is starting with this prayer and basically reframing the entire institutional context by saying, we were here before. Our institutions were here before yours. So we come with authority. It's a very different way from which to start, right? Well, we could talk a lot more about it, but the second one is bridging difference. So here the point is, we were here before, lots of things have happened. Nevertheless, we want to be here in conversation with you, right? And so here we are giving testimonial, following your rules, but remember, we're coming from a different perspective. And then the third one, unleashing human energies. A lot of that is about regaining their own subjectivity and bringing their cultural traditions as a very important and powerful resource to engage in leadership work. And so look at the beautiful huipil that this woman is, oh, can you see it from there? That this woman is using, I don't know if you can see it, it has all different kinds of colors. It's very different from the traditional suit that you would expect someone to find in the court, right? She's bringing this garment, and by bringing this garment, she's embodying also a different sense of self, a sense of self where the cultural element is bringing the energy that she needs and the passion that she needs from which to show the capacity that she has. With that in mind, then we created a larger framework where we locate these leadership practices, show their connection to the technology of management and the core organizational tasks. So I'll end just by saying, what is interesting here is that we've been able to understand a type of work that is really invisible when you're not paying attention to and entering this work with an encounter of the epistemologies that we were talking about, that gets lost, that nobody sees, that gets lost from the books and everything. And by bringing it up and showing how that work that is very focused and intentional, we bring back the notion of leadership as a collective achievement and can bring that back into the conversation to be able to theorize about leadership and beef up the collective dimensions of the work. And the most interesting thing, and I'll end with that, is to say that while mainstream leadership is just discovering this idea of relationality, it's been there all along in these communities, and there's a lot that can be learned from them. And so we can bring this in and figure out how to incorporate it.
My honour in this last session to draw together some of the threads that have been talked about in this afternoon's session, and particularly to look at how do we go about then upholding Indigenous voices and deconstructing the hegemonic performativity of mainstream research as we know it. And it's important for us to do is to understand and reflect in our work our understanding of the diversity of Indigenous contexts. This is an example of the diversity of language groups and nations across Australia. So it bears very little resemblance whatsoever to the 8 territories and states and their colonial borders, which can also compound and confuse, the research journey, particularly in Central Australia, where the communities I work with move in and out of the Northern Territory, Western Australia and South Australia, and consider that's their country, and the colonial borders are fairly irrelevant to that process. So I think it's very important for us to acknowledge the diversity and to not fall into the trap of mainstream researching, essentialising and homogenising the Indigenous experience. And this is obviously true also for the United States and for Canada and for Latin America and so on. Specific people in specific places at particular points in time. And I think whilst there are overarching issues of epistemology that Michelle has provided us with, it's also understanding that there is a diversity of local expressions of that epistemology, and particularly through language. The other is, I think, a recognition. I think, the process of repair and rewriting some of the mistakes of the past starts with recognition. And that's a recognition of mainstream research as extractive, as others on the panel have mentioned throughout this afternoon's presentations. That research in itself has been imperialist and has served imperialist ends in many instances. There's been an epistemological domination. As well, research has been a tool of political economy by creating measures of development, that notion of modernisation that Anna Maria spoke of success and of viability and what constitutes those sorts of things. And you've mentioned also that this is a common experience in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa. There's been a reproduction of non-Indigenous, very much Western norms in terms of the visibility of a sort of an archetypical patriarchal white male hero figure, particularly in entrepreneurship research. We are never neutral as researchers. Every act of research we do is a political act. And I think we need to acknowledge that and understand it, and understand the dangers of this notion of expert knowledge. There's a great danger and a great pressure on us and our selfhood and our sense of pride in our professions to go into communities and be seen as experts. And the process of letting go of that is actually one that is beautiful and wonderful, but also quite difficult to do, because it means shedding a part of the identities that we've been enculturated into in many regards. Research in the mainstream context has been very much an appropriation of others' knowledge, and I think it's about reversing that process and look at the ways in which we decolonise our own minds and learn to engage in very constructive ways with other forms and ways of being. I mentioned earlier about research being a very problematic word in the Indigenous vocabulary. Equally, Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson, an Indigenous Indigenous professor in Australia, has said the phrase that I think is a very pertinent one: why are we always the known and never the knowers? And I think what Michelle and others are doing at the moment is creating, or if you like, pushing forth to create space for Indigenous scholars to be actually taken very, not just taken seriously, but actually have profound impact. And we can look forward to specific people in specific places at particular points in time. And I think whilst there are overarching issues of epistemology that Michelle has provided us with, it's also understanding that there is a diversity of local expressions of that epistemology, and particularly through language. The other is, I think, a recognition. I think, you know, the process of repair and rewriting some of the mistakes of the past starts with recognition. And that's a recognition of mainstream research as extractive, as others on the panel have mentioned throughout this afternoon's presentations. That research in itself has been imperialist and has served imperialist ends in many instances. There's been an epistemological domination. As well, research has been a tool of political economy by creating measures of development, that notion of modernisation that Anna Maria spoke of success and of viability and what constitutes those sorts of things. And you've mentioned also that this is a common experience in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa. There's been a reproduction of non-Indigenous, very much Western norms in terms of the visibility of a sort of an typical patriarchal white male hero figure, particularly in entrepreneurship research. We are never neutral as researchers. Every act of research we do is a political act. And I think we need to acknowledge that and understand it, and understand the dangers of this notion of expert knowledge. There's a great danger and a great pressure on us and our selfhood and our sense of pride in our professions to go into communities and be seen as experts. And the process of letting go of that is actually one that is beautiful and wonderful, but also quite difficult to do, because it means shedding a part of the identities that we've been enculturated into in many regards. Research in the mainstream context has been very much an appropriation of others' knowledge, and I think it's about reversing that process and look at the ways in which we decolonise our own minds and learn to engage in very constructive ways with other forms and ways of being. I mentioned earlier about research being a very problematic word in the Indigenous vocabulary. Equally, Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson, an Indigenous Indigenous professor in Australia, has said the phrase that I think is a very pertinent one: why are we always the known and never the knowers? And I think what Michelle and others are doing at the moment is creating, or if you like, pushing forth to create space for Indigenous scholars to be actually taken very, not just taken seriously, but actually have profound impact. And we can look forward to more of that. Energy I mentioned before, and myself have used whiteness theory to attempt to come to grips with some of the political economy of what was going on for our Anangu colleagues as we worked together on Indigenous enterprise experience in Central Australia. Once again, some of the, I think, utilities of that have been able to, as Aileen Morton Robinson has written, talk about sort of resistance, using whiteness as a way to urge others in mainstream culture to actually reverse the gaze. Rather than looking at the subjectivities of Indigenous people, look at one's own construction and look at the ways in which privilege actually contaminates the work that we all do and that period of engagement. So to attempting to sort of understand the discursive construction of the other and one's place in perpetuating that in the research dialogue. And I think it's a useful tool for self-monitoring. And of course, whiteness is a form of looking at a system-wide, not the colour of the skin, but system-wide force of the hegemonic relationships of the neo-colonial discourse. So it's a way of unpacking some of that process, but nevertheless doesn't always sit well with the Indigenous experience, where issues are often perhaps more subtle. And this sort of binary, or the bipolar, as others have said today, experience of attempting to talk about them and us doesn't necessarily serve the creation of a third space, of a space where we can communicate interculturally in a useful manner. The particular way which Sonia and Maria and myself have experienced, and Michelle, of working with people, working alongside people, working as witnesses in a journey together, of co-researching with Indigenous communities, I think is, for me anyway, been a profound experience which I honour and respect very, very deeply. It's about identifying power and understanding the privilege we hold as researchers, and working together in a reflexive manner that builds respect and builds a relationship. Then I think that relationship, for me anyway, is one that must not be purely move in, move out, fly in, fly out, as Anna Maria described. For me, it is about a long-term engagement in multiple research journeys with groups of people who continue, anyway, while ever they continue, to see this relationship as a worthwhile one. And it's a relationship that has many dimensions, and the research journey is a part of that dimension that flies in the face of the normal kind of positivist attitude to research. But for me, it's about reciprocity. And in Anangu culture, people talk about napaji napaji. It's the founding sort of value, if you like, and principle that people hold dear in community life. It's about the indivisible part of the collectivity that holds people together in the communities in Central Australia. And it means I give to you, you give to me. We are involved in a circle of reciprocity that is unending. And I think that's the nature of research that I see as a very profound and important one, where the accountability for my behaviour and my conduct as an academic and as a researcher is judged, if you like, in terms of that reciprocity by the communities that I'm working alongside. And it's been a rich and at times hysterically funny and enlightening journey. At one level, it's about participatory action research as another expression of co-researching, It's about whose capacity needs building. We hear a lot in the rhetoric, particularly in the development literature, about building people's capacity. And one of the first sorts of things I was involved in with the community was discussing this notion of capacity building. And it seemed to me that, as the example Sonia used, of the profound way in which people can intervene and disrupt a situation to reframe it and reclaim their agency, we really need to be asking whose capacity is being built on this journey. And for me, it's not a one-way street, as is often held up to be. Letting go of the investigator-driven research, opening to collaborative processes where people drive the research and control the design of the research and the design of the methodology, and actually have some say over the timing, or the ultimate say over the timing, and particularly what happens with the results of the research. Who owns that research? Who co-owns that research? Who authors those papers that come from that research, and what purposes do they serve? And that can be quite critical in some of the research that we do, and fundamentally about reflexivity. So in closing, I would just end up by saying the sorts of questions that arise for me in relation to that from this afternoon's session is, how can the Business Academy make space for Indigenous and other ways of seeing the world? How do we as an academy remain open to diverse ways of doing, being and knowing? And how do we, as critical management scholars and scholars from other areas of the academy, come together? Last Friday was the first day of the Academy of Management meeting was the United Nations Day of Indigenous People, and some of the themes for the forward year were about building alliances and working together. So I think these questions are very, very important ones for us in that context. At one level, it's about participatory action research as another expression of co-researching. It's about whose capacity needs building. We hear a lot in the rhetoric, particularly in the development literature, about building people's capacity. And one of the first sorts of things I was involved in with the community was discussing this notion of capacity building. And it seemed to me that, as the example Sonia used, of the profound way in which people can intervene and disrupt a situation to reframe it and reclaim their agency, we really need to be asking whose capacity is being built on this journey. And for me, it's not a one-way street, as is often held up to be. Letting go of the investigator-driven research, opening to collaborative processes where people drive the research and control the design of the research and the design of the methodology, and actually have some say over the timing, or the ultimate say over the timing, and particularly what happens with the results of the research. Who owns that research? Who co-owns that research? Who authors those papers that come from that research, and what purposes do they serve? And that can be quite critical in some of the research that we do, and fundamentally about reflexivity. So in closing, I would just end up by saying the sorts of questions that arise for me in relation to that from this afternoon's session is, how can the Business Academy make space for Indigenous and other ways of seeing the world? How do we as an academy remain open to diverse ways of doing, being and knowing? And how do we, as critical management scholars and scholars from other areas of the Academy come together. Last Friday was the first day of the Academy of Management meeting was the United Nations Day of Indigenous People, and some of the themes for the forward year were about building alliances and working together. So I think these questions are very, very important ones for us in that context.